Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Speak Smart podcast. So you have a job interview coming up. Congratulations.
Yeah.
But you're feeling those pre-interview jitters. But hey, that's totally normal. Everyone gets them.
Right.
That's why we're doing a deep dive into a fantastic podcast all about acing job interviews. Especially for those of you who speak English as a second language, we're going to uncover some seriously useful tips and strategies to help you rock that interview.
Absolutely. It's all about preparation, right? Whether you're a seasoned pro or just starting out, having a solid game plan can make all the difference.
Absolutely. This podcast really stresses the importance of research before you even step into the interview room. And I'm not just talking about skimming the company's About Us page. It's about going deeper, understanding their values, culture, even their recent successes and challenges.
What's fascinating to me is how this deeper level of research can help you answer those tricky, why do you want to work here questions in a way that truly stands out. Imagine being able to talk about a recent company initiative that aligns perfectly with your own passions. Oh, yeah.
Or ask insightful questions about their future plans. That's the kind of preparation that makes a real impact.
I love that. It shows you're not just looking for any job, but that you're genuinely interested in this company and what they stand for. Okay, so we've got the company research down. What about the job description itself? Any tips on how to really dissect it and use it to our advantage?
Well, podcast suggests treating the job description like a treasure map, filled with clues about what the hiring manager is truly looking for. Highlight those keywords, the skills and experiences they emphasize, and then brainstorm specific examples from your own background that demonstrate those qualities.
Okay, I see where you're going with this. Instead of just saying, I'm a great communicator, you're saying, in my previous role, I had to present a complex technical concept to a non-technical audience, and I did this by, am I on the right track?
Exactly. It's all about showing, not just telling. And the job description gives you the roadmap for what to show. Now, even with all this research and preparation, I know I'd still be practicing my answers beforehand. The podcast has some interesting advice that goes beyond just saying your answers out loud, right?
Right. They recommend role-playing with a friend, or even recording yourself answering common interview questions. This helps you identify any nervous habits, like saying, too much, or areas where your answers could be more concise or impactful.
I think that's brilliant. Sometimes we don't even realize our own nervous habits until we see or hear ourselves. Okay, so we've done our research, dissected the job description, and practiced our answers. Now let's talk about what happens when we're actually in the interview. How do we tackle those classic questions that always seem to pop up?
Well, the podcast starts with the one that seems simple but can really trip people up. Tell me about yourself.
Yeah, that one always feels awkward. Like, where do I even begin?
Well, the podcast suggests a clear structure. Start with a brief intro, your name, and maybe where you're from if it's relevant. Then highlight your education and relevant experience. But here's the key. Connect it all back to why you're excited about this specific job.
I'm starting to see a theme here. It's all about tailoring your answers to the specific company and role. It's not just about reciting your resume. It's about showing how your story fits into their story.
You got it. Now, another classic question is, why do you want to work here? And this is where all that company research really pays off.
Right. It's not enough to just say, oh, the company seems great. We need to go deeper, right?
Absolutely. Think about what genuinely excites you about this company. Maybe it's their commitment to sustainability, their innovative products, or even their company culture. Whatever it is, be specific and show that your values align with theirs. It's about finding that authentic connection.
So, for example, if I was interviewing at a company known for its cutting-edge technology, I might say something like, I've always been passionate about pushing the boundaries of what's possible, and I'm truly inspired by your company's commitment to innovation.
That's a great example. It shows that you've done your homework and that you're not just looking for a paycheck, but a place where you can truly thrive. Now, another common question is, what are your strengths? And I think a lot of people struggle with this one because they either go too vague or try to list every positive quality they possess. What does the podcast suggest?
I'd imagine it's about being strategic, choosing strengths that are directly relevant to the job and then backing them up with solid examples.
You're spot on. Instead of just saying, I'm a good communicator, give a specific instance where your communication skills made a real difference. For example, in my previous role, I had to mediate a conflict between two team members, and I did this by actively listening to their concerns, facilitating a constructive dialogue, and ultimately finding a solution that worked for everyone.
Wow, that's so much more impactful than just saying, I'm a good communicator, right? It paints a picture, tells a story, and really showcases your skills in action. Okay, so we've tackled the strengths question. Now let's brace ourselves for the one that often makes people sweat. What are your weaknesses? Do you just lie and say you're a perfectionist?
I wouldn't recommend that. The podcast emphasizes honesty, but with a positive spin. Choose a weakness that's not a deal breaker for the job and explain how you're working to improve it. This shows self-awareness and a growth mindset, which employers really value.
So, for example, if you tend to be a bit too detail-oriented, you could say something like, I sometimes get caught up in the finer points, but I'm learning to prioritize tasks and delegate effectively to ensure we meet deadlines without compromising quality. Would that be a good approach?
Absolutely. It acknowledges a potential weakness, but also highlights your proactive approach to improvement. It shows you're not just aware of your flaws, but actively working to address them. Now, what happens if you get hit with a question you genuinely don't know the answer to?
Don't panic. Right. I know I'd be tempted to blurt out the first thing that comes to mind, even if it's completely off base. What's the podcast take on handling those I have no clue moments?
Honesty is key. Take a moment to think or even say, that's a great question. Let me consider that for a second. It's much better to pause and gather your thoughts than to fumble through an answer that doesn't make sense.
I think that's such reassuring advice. It takes the pressure off trying to have a perfect answer for everything. The podcast actually suggests saying something like, I'm not familiar with that specific software, but I'm eager to learn and I'm confident I can pick it up quickly. That shows you're willing to admit what you don't know, but also highlights your willingness to learn and adapt.
It's all about turning a potential negative into a positive.
Now, speaking of learning and growing, the podcast also tackles how to talk about challenges you faced at work. And they suggest using the STAR method. Can you remind our listener what STAR stands for?
Absolutely. STAR stands for situation, task, action, and result. It's a framework for structuring your answers in a clear, concise, and compelling way.
So instead of just rambling about a challenge you faced, you're breaking it down into these 4 components. Describing the situation, outlining your specific task or goal, explaining the actions you took, and highlighting the results you achieved.
It's a great way to demonstrate your problem-solving skills and showcase your ability to learn and grow from challenges. For example, you could say, in my previous role, we were facing a tight deadline for a major project. My task was to coordinate the efforts of multiple teams to ensure we delivered on time and within budget. I took action by implementing a new project management system, facilitating daily check-ins, and proactively addressing any roadblocks. As a result, we successfully launched the project on time and received positive feedback from the client.
Wow, that's a powerful example. It not only highlights your ability to handle challenges, but also showcases specific skills like project management, communication, and problem solving.
Exactly. The STAR method helps you paint a vivid picture of your experience and demonstrate your capabilities in a structured and memorable way. You know, we've been talking a lot about the what to say in a job interview, but let's shift gears and talk about the how. Nonverbal communication can really make or break your interview performance.
That's so true. It's not just about what comes out of our mouths. It's about our body language.
Yeah.
Eye contact, those subtle cues that can convey confidence or, well, the opposite.
Exactly. And the podcast goes beyond just the basics, like sit up straight. It digs into the nuances of nonverbal communication and the psychology behind it.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Give me an example.
Well, let's take posture. We all know we should sit up straight, but the podcast emphasizes why this is so important. It's not just about looking good, it's about projecting confidence and engagement.
You know, I never really thought about it that way. I always assumed good posture was just about appearing professional. But you're right. It's about showing the interviewer that you're present, attentive, and genuinely interested in the conversation.
It's about conveying that you're taking the opportunity seriously and that you're ready to actively participate in the discussion.
So slouching is a big no-no.
Got it.
What about eye contact? How much is too much? How much is too little? I always struggle with that balance.
The podcast suggests aiming for a natural flow. Maintain eye contact when you're listening, showing that you're actively absorbing what the interviewer is saying, but it's okay to look away occasionally when you're thinking or speaking.
That makes sense. Staring intently can feel a bit creepy, and constantly averting your gaze can make you seem insecure or disinterested. It's about finding that sweet spot right.
Exactly. And when you're answering a question, it can be helpful to briefly look away as you gather your thoughts, then make eye contact again as you deliver your response. It shows that you're thoughtfully considering the question and engaging with the interviewer.
What about those panel interviews where you've got multiple interviewers staring at you? How do you handle eye contact in that situation? It can be so overwhelming.
That's a great question. While you should primarily address the person who asked the question, it's important to briefly make eye contact with the other interviewers as well. It shows that you're acknowledging everyone in the room and engaging with the panel as a whole.
That's a great tip. I've always wondered about that. Now, what about smiling? Is it better to smile constantly, even if it feels a bit forced? Or just smile when something genuinely amuses you?
Smiling is definitely important for conveying warmth and approachability. But just like with eye contact, it needs to feel genuine. Don't force a smile the whole time that can actually come across as insincere.
It's about being authentic, right?
Exactly. Smile naturally at appropriate moments, like when you're greeting the interviewer, when they say something that resonates with you, or when you're discussing something you're passionate about.
So it's about letting your true personality shine through while still maintaining a professional demeanor.
What about hand gestures? I'm a pretty expressive person, and I tend to talk with my hands a lot. Is that a bad thing in an interview? Not necessarily. Natural hand gestures can actually be helpful. They can add emphasis to your points and show your enthusiasm, but be aware of any distracting or repetitive movements like constantly fidgeting with your pen or playing with your hair.
So keep those hand gestures purposeful and controlled, using them to enhance your communication rather than distract from it.
Precisely. Now let's talk about handshakes. Are those still relevant, especially with virtual interviews becoming more and more common?
You know, that's something I've been wondering about. Is the handshake a dying art form?
Well, the podcast emphasizes that a firm handshake is still a key part of making a good first impression, at least in in-person interviews. It's a classic sign of confidence and professionalism.
I can see how a weak or limp handshake could send the wrong message. It's about showing that you're assertive and engaged right.
Exactly. Aim for a handshake that's firm, but not bone-crushing. And make eye contact and smile while shaking hands. It's about conveying warmth and respect.
Okay, those are all great tips for in-person interviews. But what about virtual interviews? Any nonverbal tips for those?
Absolutely. Even though you're not physically in the same room, nonverbal communication is still crucial in a virtual setting. The podcast really stresses the importance of looking at the camera when you're speaking, not at the screen.
That's a good one. I'm so guilty of looking at myself on the screen during video calls. It feels more natural to look at the person's face. But you're right, looking at the camera creates that sense of eye contact even through a screen.
It's a subtle but important distinction. It helps build connection and engagement. And speaking of screens, the podcast also highlights the importance of having a clean and professional background.
That makes total sense. You wouldn't want a pile of laundry or dirty dishes in the background during your interview. It's about showing that you've put thought and effort into presenting yourself professionally.
Exactly. Think of your background as an extension of your professional image.
Now here's a question that surprised me. The podcast suggests dressing up, even if the interview is virtual. Is that really necessary? I mean, if they could only see my top half, wouldn't it be okay to wear sweatpants on the bottom?
While it might seem like overkill, dressing professionally, even if it's just from the waist up, can actually put you in the right mindset and boost your confidence.
I can see the logic there. It's like putting on your game face.
Yeah.
Even if it's not visible, it can have a psychological impact on how you feel and present yourself.
Exactly. It's about setting yourself up for success both mentally and visually.
Now let's talk about active listening. How do you show that you're really paying attention, especially in a virtual setting where it could be easy to get distracted?
Active listening is so important, whether the interview is in person or virtual. Nodding occasionally, maintaining eye contact, or looking at the camera in a virtual setting and using verbal cues like, I see, or that's interesting, all show that you're following along and engaged in the conversation.
It's about showing that you're not just hearing the words, but actually absorbing and processing the information.
Exactly. And of course, it goes without saying, but avoid interrupting the interviewer. Let them finish speaking before you respond. It shows respect and a willingness to listen.
Okay, so we've covered the basics of nonverbal communication, but the podcast also mentions something called mirroring. What is that exactly?
Mirroring is a subtle technique where you subtly reflect the interviewer's body language. If they lean forward, you might lean forward slightly. If they use a certain hand gesture, you might use a similar one.
So it's about creating a subconscious sense of rapport.
Precisely. It's about finding common ground and establishing a connection.
but I imagine there's a fine line between subtle mirroring and outright imitation, right? You wouldn't want to come across as creepy or insincere.
You're exactly right. Mirroring is most effective when it's done subtly and unconsciously. It should feel natural, not forced.
Okay, so mirroring, but with caution. Got it. Any other nonverbal tips before we move on?
One last one, be mindful of your facial expressions. Your expressions can convey a lot of information, so make sure they're aligned with what you're saying. If you're discussing a challenge, a serious or thoughtful expression is appropriate. If you're talking about something you're passionate about, let your enthusiasm show.
It's about being aware of how your face is communicating and making sure your expressions are authentic and appropriate to the conversation.
Well said. Now let's move on to what you should do after the interview to really solidify that positive impression.
Okay, so the interview's done. You've nailed those tough questions, and hopefully your nonverbal communication was on point. But here's the thing. The interview process isn't actually over yet. What you do after the interview can be just as important as what you do during.
Yeah. The podcast really emphasizes that. You're right. It's like the final act of a play. You want to leave the audience with a lasting positive impression.
So what's the best way to do that? What's the encore performance of the job interview world?
The podcast is a big advocate for sending a thank you note. It's not just about good manners, it's about strategy.
Okay, I can see how a thank you note shows your appreciation, but does it really make a difference in the hiring decision?
It absolutely can. A well-written thank you note reinforces your interest in the position, reiterates your qualifications, and helps you stay top of mind. It's your chance to leave a lasting impression.
So it's not just a formality, it's a strategic move. Got it. But what's the best way to send a thank you note? Email or snail mail? I always struggle with that.
That's a great question. The podcast mentions that both email and traditional mail have their advantages. Email is faster and ensures your note reaches the interviewer promptly.
Which is key in today's fast-paced world.
Right. But a handwritten note can add a personal touch and make you stand out.
I can see how a handwritten note might be more memorable, especially in a sea of digital communication. Shows you went the extra mile.
Exactly. The choice ultimately depends on the company culture and the nature of the interview. If it was a very formal interview, a handwritten note might be more appropriate. If it was a more casual setting, an email could be perfectly fine.
So you're saying tailor the thank you note to the situation, just like we tailored our answers during the interview. It's all about reading the room, or in this case, reading the company.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've decided on the format, but what should we actually say in the thank you note?
That's $1 million question.
Yeah.
The podcast provides a helpful structure. Start by addressing the interviewer by name and expressing your gratitude for their time and the opportunity to interview. Then mention something specific that you discussed during the interview to personalize the note.
Oh, that's a great tip. It shows you are really paying attention and that the conversation resonated with you.
Right. Then reiterate your interest in the position and briefly remind them of your qualifications. You want to reinforce why you're a great fit for the role. Finally, thank them again and express your hope to hear back soon.
Simple but effective. Now, what about after you hit send on that thank you note? Should you just sit back and wait to hear back? I know I'd be refreshing my inbox every 5 minutes.
While it's important to be patient, the podcast emphasizes the importance of reflection and continued action.
Okay, so what kind of reflection are we talking about? Should I be analyzing every word I said, rethinking every answer? I'm already overthinking things enough as it is.
Take some time to think about how the interview went, what questions were asked, how did you answer them, was there anything you wish you had said differently? It's not about beating yourself up. It's about learning and growing.
It's like doing a post-game analysis of your performance. You identify areas for improvement and celebrate your successes.
Exactly. This self-assessment can help you prepare for future interviews and continuously refine your skills.
I love that perspective. It's not just about getting this job. It's about becoming the best possible candidate for any opportunity that comes your way.
That's the goal. While you're reflecting, don't put all your eggs in one basket. The podcast encourages you to continue your job search, even while you're waiting to hear back from this particular interview.
That makes sense. Keep applying for other positions, attending other interviews. It's about staying proactive and keeping those options open.
Exactly. And speaking of staying proactive, the podcast also mentions the importance of networking after the interview.
Oh, that's interesting. What do they recommend?
Connect with the interviewer on professional networking sites like LinkedIn. It's a way to stay on their radar and show your continued interest.
But I wouldn't want to seem too pushy. Is there a right way to send a connection request after an interview?
Keep it brief and professional. Personalize your message by mentioning the interview and expressing your appreciation for their time. You could say something like, "It was a pleasure meeting you during the interview for the position. I enjoyed learning more about company name and the role. I'd love to connect and stay in touch."
Okay, that sounds good. So to recap, after the interview, we send a thank you note, reflect on our performance, keep applying for other jobs, and network with the interviewer. Anything else?
One last thing. The podcast stresses the importance of handling rejection gracefully. If you don't get the job, don't take it personally. It's just part of the process.
I know that's easier said than done. It's hard not to feel discouraged when you get a rejection. But you're right, it's important to remember that it's not a reflection of your worth.
Exactly. Every interview is a learning experience. Even if you don't get the job, you've gained valuable practice and insights that will help you in future interviews.
It's about focusing on the long game, continuously improving, and never giving up.
Well said.
Well, I think this has been a really informative deep dive into acing job interviews in English.
I agree.
We've covered so much ground today.
Yeah.
From pre-interview prep to those tricky questions to nonverbal communication and even what to do after the interview.
And remember, preparation is key. The more prepared you are, the more confident you'll feel. And that confidence will shine through in your interview.
And don't forget the power of reflection. Every interview is an opportunity for growth.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you so much for joining us for this episode. We hope these tips and strategies will help you rock your next job interview. And as always,
And good luck.
thank you for listening to the Speak Smart podcast.